If it's Tuesday, former President Trump chooses the courtroom over the campaign trail as he attends a hearing in Washington, D.C. on presidential immunity, while his primary rivals hit the trail with just 6 days until Iowa. Plus, the Pentagon reveals a prostate cancer diagnosis is the reason behind Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin's mysterious stay in intensive care. We're going to have the details on the Pentagon chief's condition and the growing questions surrounding the breakdown in the chain of command. And salacious and serious allegations filed in court against Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis, claiming she had an improper romantic relationship with a top prosecutor in her sweeping election racketeering case against former President Donald Trump. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Peter Alexander in Washington. Just 6 days before the Iowa Republican caucuses, Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, Vivek Ramaswamy, they are all hitting the trail in the Hawkeye state, trying to turn every last Iowan into a caucus goer. But the race's frontrunner, Donald Trump, took a very different strategy today, appearing voluntarily in a Washington, D.C. federal courtroom. Mr. Trump's lawyers are trying to get a federal appeals court to dismiss special counsel Jack Smith's criminal charges tied to his efforts to overturn the 2020 election. In court today, the former president's attorney argued that the Constitution gave him sweeping legal protections and presidential immunity. The judges, however, seemed highly skeptical of that argument.
Could a president who ordered SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival who was not impeached, would he be subject to criminal prosecution?
If he were impeached and convicted first. And
so your answer is
no. My answer is qualified yes. There's a political process that would have to occur under the structure of our Constitution, which would require impeachment and conviction by the Senate.
Lawyers for the Justice Department echoed the judge's comments with their own pushback.
What kind of world are we living in if, as I understood my friend on the other side to say here, a president orders his SEAL team to assassinate a political rival and resigns, for example, before an impeachment? Not a criminal act. President sells a pardon, resigns, or is not impeached? Not a crime. I think that is extraordinarily frightening future.
So we're going to get into the legal merits of the hearing and what it means for Mr. Trump's legal standing shortly. But first, the big picture politics. Just 6 days, as we noted, before the Iowa caucuses, with other candidates trying to reach as many Iowans as possible. Mr. Trump's choice to skip the trail and spend the day in court shows us a very different kind of calculation. The campaign appears to be betting that the visual of Trump in a courtroom is more powerful as its closing message than the alternative, as they try to convince Republicans that he is a victim. And it turns out this may be working. Here's what we have been hearing from Iowans over just the last several days.
He said their main goal is not to come after me. They're trying to stop me because they want to come after you. I feel like that's the main thing that they're trying to do.
I say when Jesus died, he died for us. So he did it for us. So when Trump is facing all these things, he's doing it for us in our place. When they are indicting him, we are being indicted. When they talk negative about him, they're talking negative about us. You understand?
And then there is the fact that Mr. Trump's lawyers in court are arguing for a maximalist view of executive power as the former president runs for another term and has indicated that he would use such authority. He pledged to act like a, quote, dictator on day one, and yesterday threatened his likely general election opponent with a payback indictment. After the hearing, Mr. Trump seemed to again make the implicit threat that if he does not get immunity from criminal prosecution, then Joe Biden will not get it either.
It's a very bad precedent. As we said, it's the opening of a Pandora's box, and that's a very sad thing that's happened with this whole situation. When they talk about threat to democracy, that's your real threat to democracy. If you didn't have immunity, as an example, Joe Biden with the prosecutor, we're not going to give you $1 billion unless you get rid of the prosecutor that's after the company or his son or whoever it is they're after. But he wanted that prosecutor gone, and he's on tape saying it. Or you could say the horrible job he's done at the border, where our country is being destroyed.
Joining me now for more on Mr. Trump's legal latest is NBC News senior legal correspondent and my co-anchor on Saturday Today, Laura Jarrett, and former U.S. Attorney and NBC News legal analyst Joyce Vance. Also with us is Vaughn Hilliard, braving the chilly elements in Des Moines, Iowa this morning. He's on the campaign trail. Vaughn, we're going to keep you standing there in the cold for a little longer. I promise we'll get to you in just a moment. Laura, I do want to get to you with these headlines, though, if we can, very quickly. So break down for us what we heard from both lawyers, both sides in today's hearing.
Peter, the basic argument from Mr. Trump's side here is that he should be completely immune from prosecution, as you laid out there, because he was acquitted by the Senate. They've really sort of tied their entire wagon to that argument because Trump was acquitted by the Senate and wasn't convicted. Therefore, they say to bring this case now would be unjust. In their view, he would be essentially tried for the same thing twice, even though, of course, that wasn't a criminal case. That was a political proceeding. That was not an argument that seemed to buy any purchase with the three judges on this court, two appointed by President Biden, another Bush appointee on that court. All seemed very, very skeptical of this argument. The Justice Department, in turn, Peter, arguing that Mr. Trump is not above the law and that it should be, frankly, frightening, in their words, frightening, to give any credence to this position, which would essentially allow Mr. Trump to escape all criminal culpability.
And, Laura, to be clear, former President Trump had no legal obligation to be in the courtroom. This was entirely voluntary, and in the eyes of a lot of folks, this was viewed as a as a political effort here, correct?
And we've seen him use that before, sort of using these courtroom hearings, which are routine, as almost campaign stops. Now, this was not a place where he could actually talk in the hallways, as you've seen him do in this New York civil fraud case. That's why you see him resort to a hotel ballroom, or rather conference room there. But he certainly managed to figure out a way to get his message out with 6 days to go until the Iowa caucus is spending his time in Washington, D.C. voluntarily.
So walk us through where we go here. What is next in this case? How soon do we expect the court's answer to this appeal? Where does it go next? Is this likely to end up at the Supreme Court? What does the next several weeks or months look like?
Okay, I think it's pretty likely they're going to move fast on this within the D.C. circuit, given how they've already set this on sort of an expedited timeline. Usually an appeal like this wouldn't even happen today for months, but the fact that they heard it so quickly shows that the judges recognize sort of the gravity here. There is a trial date set for March, which I think is fair to say is in jeopardy, but perhaps not completely doomed. Obviously, a lot of steps could happen in between now and then. If Mr. Trump was to lose in front of the D.C. circuit on this argument that was heard today, he could then go to the full panel of D.C. judges there, or he could try to go straight to the Supreme Court. But any one of those moves takes time, and it's up to the judges and justices in the Supreme Court's case to decide how fast they want to respond to it, Peter. So the timeline here really depends on what the courts want to do.
Laura, thank you. We'll let you do some more reporting. We'll look forward to seeing your report on NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt this evening. Joyce, to you, if I can, I want your sort of legal take of Mr. Trump's lawyers' arguments today and their broad view that they argue presidential power and immunity, basically the president's entitled to these unique powers and this unique presidential immunity.
Right. So, Peter, Trump's argument at bottom is that presidents are kings, that a president who doesn't act while he's in office, as long as there's even a theoretical argument that it's part of his official duties, that he's immune from prosecution for all time. While he's in office, after he leaves office, he can never be held accountable. And of course, as Laura said, the panel judges aren't inclined to go there for the obvious reasons that that would in essence be the end of democracy if presidents could do whatever they wanted to. It was the hypotheticals that the judges tried to test here that drove that point home. Asking, for instance, whether it would be possible for a president to take a bribe in exchange for granting a pardon, and then so long as he avoided any form of conviction for impeachment, whether that was by early resignation or even by taking steps like having senators who would vote against him killed so he couldn't be convicted, whether that would release him from any threat of prosecution. And of course, Trump's lawyers had to concede, ultimately, they fought the hypothetical, but had to concede that that would be the case, because that is their argument, that Trump is above the law.
Joyce, we're going to give you a second. I think we're having a little trouble with your audio. It's a little quiet. I want to make sure we fix that so we can finish this conversation. Let me ask you, if I can, Vaughn, very quickly about the circumstances and the way they're being viewed by those Iowa caucus goers. The Trump campaign clearly thinks the best place to have their candidate 6 days out from Iowa is in a courtroom as opposed to in Iowa. What's the view on the ground there?
Right. I think that, number one here, Peter, there is intense interest in what is happening inside of the courtroom. So to Donald Trump's defense, yes, this is voluntary for him to show up. But in real time, I rely on the likes of Joyce Vance, and he relies on his legal team to have an understanding of the fate of this election, federal election interference trial. For Donald Trump, we're just 5 days away here from the Iowa caucus. And let's be frank here, Peter. The new Morning Consult poll that just came out in the last 24 hours has him up 58% to Nikki Haley's 18% and Ron DeSantis's 15%. So these numbers are stark. And for him, he has made the calculation that he can go and not only hear what's taking place in that courtroom, but then go and speak to the cameras, whether it's in a hotel room or whether it's in the case on Thursday in Lower Manhattan following the closing arguments in that civil fraud trial. He can go outside of the courthouse doors there and address cameras and speak to a wide national audience. I want to let you hear, though, from Donald Trump, who continues to talk to right-wing outlets. He will be taking part in a town hall here on Fox News on Wednesday, but I want to let you hear a conversation he had with right-wing provocateur Lou Dobbs last night, in which he talked about the economy as he gears up for a general election race against Joe Biden. Take a listen.
We have an economy that's so fragile, and the only reason it's running now is it's running off the fumes of what we did, what the Trump administration. It's just running off the fumes. And when there's a crash, I hope it's going to be during this next 12 months, because I don't want to be Herbert Hoover.
Per normal for the last 8 years, Peter, you just heard Donald Trump there suggest that he hopes the stock market crashes over the next 10 months here before the presidential election. And so while he has the legal ongoing, he has a campaign operation here in Iowa. Donald Trump is also doing interviews as he looks towards a general election and his own view of what should happen to the economy in order for him to have his best political prospects ahead here, Peter.
And, Vaughn, I'm struck as we hear the former president make those comments is, excuse me, during the last campaign, he was saying that if Joe Biden won the presidency, that the stock market would tank. In fact, we've seen the market get to record highs right now. Now the former president is rooting for it to crash down. I want to get back to this criminal case, this case that we're witnessing, the presidential immunity. His lawyer's arguments amount effectively to this sort of broad view of executive power. How does that mesh with his vision for a second term? And how do people there view it? Is this a case of sort of taking him seriously, but not literally?
I think that that's where a lot of the hypotheticals that Joyce just laid out, Peter, are very real. We watched, for the unbelievable idea that, the Supreme Court could potentially even kick him off of the ballot under the 14th Amendment. We all watched the unbelievable with the attack on the Capitol. And there were serious constitutional debates that you were very much a part of, and I in Washington, D.C. were very much engaged in the aftermath of the January 6th attack before he left the White House on January 20th. And you'll recall it was in February of 2021, just weeks after leaving the White House, in which there were Republican senators who voted to not convict Donald Trump on the impeachment charges because they said it was not constitutionally sound and that they could not, the Congress could not, impeach and convict a former president of the United States. And in fact, Donald Trump's own attorney, arguing in those impeachment proceedings, Peter, made the case that that criminal action could be taken against a former president, which is now what you're seeing the special counsel do. And so now his legal team, this current legal team, is arguing the exact opposite of what his legal team, who was defending him in those impeachment proceedings, was arguing in February of 2021. So this is the part. Donald Trump has had a lot of legal teams here, Peter, but there's definitely, Donald Trump is looking to expand the use of executive power come 2025 if he were to get back in the White House. Yeah. And that's where I think that a lot of these constitutional questions that have not been really challenged at this point are real. And that's why I think Joyce's observations here are so prudent.
And Joyce is still with us. Joyce, apparently the audio issue was my ear, not your microphone. So let's continue our conversation. I do want to play for you some of what Mr. Trump's counsel's reaction was to the government's warning of a, quote, frightening future if the court were to side with Mr. Trump. Here it is.
What he is forecasting is a situation where the floodgates will be opened. We are in a situation where we have the prosecution of the chief political opponent who's winning in every poll. Presidential election upcoming next year and is being prosecuted by the administration that he's seeking to replace. That is the frightening future. That is tailor-made to launch cycles of recrimination that will shake our republic for the future.
Just want to get your reaction to those comments from Mr. Trump's counsel, Joyce.
Well, the government's reaction in oral argument was the best one. They pointed out that the floodgates wouldn't be open, but that any future president who did what Donald Trump did, trying to interfere with the election, should be prosecuted. The reason that they said there wouldn't be a flood of future charges is because our legal system has certain built-in guarantees. Prosecutors are expected to behave in a professional manner regardless of who's in the White House. Grand juries have to vote on indictments before they can move forward. Trial juries have to vote that the government has met its burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt before there's a conviction. And even after that point, we have appellate courts who review convictions. So this notion that there will be some sort of politicization of the criminal justice process, that's a uniquely Trumpian attitude. In fact, that's something that the former president has said he would do if he were reelected. That is not a concern if Trump is held accountable for his arguably criminal conduct.
Joyce, just to clarify, for those who are keeping eyes on this and trying to keep track of all the different cases going on right now, how bullish are you that these all get resolved in some form in court before the election, specifically this case in D.C.?
Yeah, I don't think that they do all get resolved. The timeline is largely up to the courts. This case, the D.C. prosecution could and should go to trial before the election. But as Laura explained, there are some issues that the court has to deal with in terms of whether they'll move this more speedily than the typical case. Normally, Trump would have a lengthy period of time just to take this appeal to the Supreme Court. That March trial date, I think, is off the books because Judge Chutkan has indicated she needs about a month to pick a jury before case starts. But it's not unrealistic to expect trial could start in April or May.
I know we're going to be talking to you a lot over the course of the next several months. Joyce Vance, always a pleasure to have you with us. Von Hilliard, my friend, stay warm out there. Good luck over the course of the next week. And coming up here next, we are following new developments in the Trump trials in Georgia, where the credibility of Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis and her RICO case against the former president is now in jeopardy. The details of these allegations against Willis and the fallout is ahead. Plus, the Pentagon now revealing that Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has been diagnosed with prostate cancer amid growing scrutiny over the Pentagon's lack of disclosures surrounding Austin's recent stay in the ICU. He remains hospitalized tonight. The latest details and reaction is coming up. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back, and turning now to breaking news out of the Pentagon as we learn new details today about what led to Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin's mysterious stay in the ICU that officials failed to disclose to the public and to the president. According to a new statement from Walter Reed Medical Center, after routine health screening last month, Secretary Austin was diagnosed with prostate cancer and then underwent a minimally invasive procedure to treat and cure it. That was December 22nd. On January 1st, Austin was then admitted to Walter Reed and sent to the ICU the next day due to complications from that procedure. But the public, the president, even Austin's deputy were left in the dark about the situation for days. During a briefing with reporters today, the Pentagon spokesperson said that the department does not have any details on the timing of Austin's release from the hospital. And at this afternoon's White House press briefing, the National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby said that President Biden also only learned about Austin's diagnosis today. Joining me now is Courtney Kuby at the Pentagon for us. Courtney, what specifically did we learn new today? And do we know why the secrecy around a relatively common medical condition for men of Austin's age? This, in effect, was an elective procedure. He went under general anesthesia when it took place in December. Power was transferred then, but nothing was communicated about exactly what the circumstances were until today to the president.
Yeah, so we know his diagnosis, this prostate cancer diagnosis, actually came in early December. But as we just heard from the White House podium today, the White House was not even informed about his cancer diagnosis until today. And I can tell you, senior officials here in the Pentagon also were not informed about it until today. So December 22nd, he had this prostatectomy, which is a surgical procedure to remove this prostate cancer. He spent the night in the hospital, Walter Reed, and was released the next day with what doctors said was a good prognosis. Well, about 10 days later on New Year's Day, he started experiencing some severe pain in his abdomen, his hip, his leg, and nausea, to the point where he was transported via ambulance back to Walter Reed that evening. Now, initially, Peter, he was diagnosed with a urinary tract infection, but by the next day, they realized that he had this buildup of excess fluid in his abdomen, and it was impairing the function of his small intestine. They had to conduct a procedure to get that excess fluid out, and there was an ensuing infection. All of that now, apparently, according to this statement, he is on the mend from that, but they do acknowledge it will be a slow process for him to completely recover from this. So Secretary Austin still in the hospital now. We don't have a date on when he might get out, but we should expect him to be in there for several more days at this point. But that gets to the bigger question here, which is the fact that all of this has been kept not just from the public, not just from the senior officials here in the Pentagon, but from the White House, from the President of the United States, Secretary Austin, being diagnosed a month ago with prostate cancer and never sharing that with his commander-in-chief. This has led to a couple of reviews, one here at the Pentagon that's looking at the notification process. How is the Secretary of Defense taken via ambulance to a hospital, placed in the intensive care unit, and the White House not notified for 3 days? How does that happen? We'll get answers to that in about 30 days, maybe 29 days, since it was notified yesterday. But now there's also this new memo out of Jeff Zients, the White House Chief of Staff, also looking at the reporting procedures and directing cabinet officials that they need to do a better job of notifying in cases like this, if you're hospitalized or if there's a transfer of power or authority. Yeah, so many questions still unclear, unanswered. We'll be watching you on Nightly News tonight. Courtney, thank you so much. And we do want to turn now to those new and salacious, serious allegations against the top prosecutor in Donald Trump's Georgia election interference case. One of the former president's co-defendants filed a motion in court yesterday alleging that Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis was engaged in an improper relationship with a top prosecutor on the case. The co-defendant who made those claims is a former Trump staffer. His name's Michael Roman. Lawyers for Roman told the court they have evidence that the district attorney had a, quote, ongoing personal and romantic relationship with Nathan Wade, whom Willis hired as a special prosecutor to lead the case. According to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution that first broke this news, quote, the bombshell public filing alleged that special prosecutor Nathan Wade, a private attorney, paid for lavish vacations he took with Willis using the Fulton County funds his law firm received. The filing does not lay out any specific evidence to back up those allegations, but a spokesperson for the DA's office has not yet denied them. The office says it will respond in a court filing. So to get a better understanding of all of this, we are joined now by one of the journalists that first reported this story for the AJC, Tamar Hallerman. Also with me is NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalos. Tamar, let me start with you if I can. What corroboration, if any, have you received in terms of this story? We know the allegations. Have there been any independent corroborating facts that we've been able to uncover?
Not really. There have been some invoices, basically, that Special Prosecutor Nathan Wade had filed with his law firm that were attached to this court filing. But in terms of some of the most salacious allegations, particularly related to some of these vacations that DA Willis allegedly took with Nathan Wade, we haven't seen any corroborating evidence yet. And the lawyer who ended up filing these allegations, Ashley Merchant, indicated that a lot of them are tied up in divorce proceedings that Nathan Wade is in the middle of with his ex-wife. Those records were sealed. The attorney believes they were improperly sealed, and she's attempting to get them unsealed. But in the meantime, it's left these uncomfortable allegations out in the open without the detail to back it up. Ashley Merchant is a longtime defense attorney here in Atlanta. She's well respected. She has a history of kind of uncovering stuff, especially there were judges who were talking about clients of hers she was able to uncover. So I don't take it lightly, but at the same time, we still don't have those corroborating details.
So why don't we think the DA's office has denied this yet?
It's unclear at this point, but I think they believe that the best forum to respond to all of this is in court filings, which is generally the tack that they've taken over the course of this investigation. It will be very interesting to see what they say about this, if anything at all, during a pair of hearings on Friday in front of Judge Scott McAfee, who's overseeing the case. He's considering a bunch of motions that don't have to do with this specific filing, but of course, it will be the first time we've seen everyone in court since these bombshell allegations became public.
Danny, help us understand the seriousness of this. How significant should we view these allegations right now, and what real impact could they have as this process is pursued?
Well, we have to take a look at the objective of this motion. The motion wants to completely dismiss the prosecution. I'm not entirely sure that that would be the remedy, even if there is an improper relationship. Far more likely might be to disqualify those individual prosecutors. But I didn't see a lot in the motion that challenged the fundamental prosecution itself. And when you look at, really, there is a core to the motion that has more merit, I think, than just the salacious allegations. For example, the allegation that the special prosecutor may have been improperly appointed, that procedure was not followed. That is probably a stronger argument. It might have been made without all of the other allegations of the improper romantic relationship. There's also an allegation, for example, that essentially the salary paid to the special prosecutor is improperly used, allegedly because it was used to go on vacations as part of the relationship. Look, these are really, really scandalous allegations, if true, but I'm not entirely sure they achieve the objective sought by the defendant, or that they'll help. But they certainly put the pressure on the prosecution. Whether it's proper pressure or improper pressure, that's for the court to decide.
And Danny, what is the threshold to achieve an allegation like this? I mean, are there risks to Roman in filing this claim if it turns out that there's no merit to it?
Strangely enough, you are more privileged to make allegations in a filing than you would be out in the public or even here on air. Things that would be defamatory on air or in a newspaper are often privileged when made in a filing or in a question in open court, for example. So here's the rule that generally applies for attorneys, because we often have to file things without the benefit of discovery upon information and belief, as we often put in our pleadings. Hopeful, at least, that when we get to discovery, we'll learn, we'll confirm what we believed that we allege. So we are given some leeway. I think the real red flag would be if this was a filing made knowing that it was false, which I don't see any indication that there's knowledge of falsity. I'm just giving an example. But you don't need a tremendous amount of rock-solid evidence before you make an allegation. That's the essence, unfortunately, of allegations. We often make them without the benefit of the documents that we want to confirm those allegations. We get those later in discovery.
Tamar, to be clear here, as Danny indicated, a possible remedy, and this is way down the road at this point, would be basically to remove those prosecutors who are, accused of this. Well, that would remove the top prosecutor, and it would remove Fani Willis, who is the DA here. Give us a sense of, what sort of impact this is having down there and the impact this is having potentially on this case.
Well, it's a massive impact, and we're already starting to see it reverberate, especially in our state legislature. Today is the second day of the legislative session, and you're already hearing Republican critics, longtime Republican critics of this probe, using these allegations as a way to push forward some changes that they'd like to make to a new oversight council that was created last year for prosecutors here in Georgia. The Georgia Supreme Court recently ruled that basically kind of mooted this commission's existence. Well, legislators now want to go in and change the state law to give it more teeth. Democrats so far are not saying much. I think they're really worried about the optics. They don't want to get ahead of the DA here. But certainly, if DA Willis were to be removed from this case, that would be huge, and it could potentially mean the death of this case, depending on who would end up being appointed to replace her. If, for example, it's the Georgia Attorney General, well, that's a Republican.
Wow.
Who probably wouldn't want to oversee this.
Yeah, you can imagine Donald Trump and plenty of other co-defendants in that case are keeping a real close eye on these latest allegations right now as we try to get better understanding of what's true and what is not in this situation. Tamar Hallerman, we appreciate your being with us. Danny Savalas, as always, thank you so much. And up next right here, embattled Democratic Senator Bob Menendez responding to new federal corruption charges on the Senate floor, what it means for Congress, corruption, and U.S. politics. Our panel is here next. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. We are now in the final days, believe it or not, of two crucial countdowns. As we said at the top of the show, there are now only 6 days until the caucuses in Iowa, the start officially of the 2024 primary season. And only a few days after that, Congress is facing yet another government shutdown deadline, the first of what could be a few expected in 2024, with funding for key programs set to run out just, 10 days from now. And joining me for our conversation, our panel, Dan Merica, national political reporter at The Messenger, Kimberly Atkins Stohr, columnist at the Boston Globe and an NBC News political analyst, and Sarah Chamberlain, president of the Republican Main Street Partnership. Dan, let me start with you. We're not even a week until Iowa, believe it or not. We're finally counting down the days. The frigid temperatures there are a dead giveaway for it being time for the caucuses here. Donald Trump, in these waning days with a big advantage in Iowa right now, has made the strategic decision that it's better to be in a courtroom here in Washington, D.C. than it is to be in a hall alongside those caucus goers in Iowa. Clearly, this is the strategy, right? Basically focus on what he says is my grievance and why you should care.
I mean, it's a strange flex, but it's working. I mean, he is showing that he doesn't really have to be in Iowa to win the Iowa caucuses. He doesn't have to be in New Hampshire to win the New Hampshire primary. And that has kind of blown a hole in this whole idea that you got to shake hands, you got to have 3 conversations with voters to win them over in Iowa. Donald Trump is pretty much proving that that's not true, because he has a huge lead in Iowa. He has, depending on what poll you read, a lead in New Hampshire. So why not, if you're him, go to this trial, say what you want afterwards, and make your political point that is a lot about grievance, that he's, aggrieved and he's being attacked, but he's doing it on behalf of you, instead of going to a pizza ranch in Iowa where he's up by 30 points. And it seems like the voters respond enough to his courtroom antics and what happens in the courtroom. He doesn't really need to be in Iowa.
And Sarah, fundamentally, I mean, all the other Republicans' efforts, their arrows, they just keep sort of bouncing off Donald Trump right now, right? They try to say, hey, this is about him. There's going to be chaos nonetheless. These caucus goers, and we've been hearing from them over the course of this day and over the course of the last several weeks, they're like, no, he's standing up for us.
Yeah. Right. They love him. In my opinion, there's never been anything like this in history. I mean, he can do no wrong. When he said he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue, and his fans, which I call them fans, his believers wouldn't leave him, they're right. I mean, it doesn't matter what he does. He is solid. He's going to win overwhelmingly in the next 2 or 3 caucuses. There's no question that he's probably going to be the Republican nominee.
Well, so then yes, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that's one reason why he's doing things like showing up at these courthouses and making his speeches there. I'm certain that he will be at the Supreme Court next month, too, when that case is argued, and make that case there, because he's in full general election mode. He is looking past the primary and trying to reach voters like those that are interviewed in places like New Hampshire that say, as of right now, they don't want to vote for him, but they also think that all of these cases against him are nonsense, that it's government, that it's political. He's going to try to reach them, too, to try to make that same case. I am working for you. They're after me because I'm here for you.
Sarah, I'm just curious what any past Republican candidate for president would think of the likely nominee saying things like, hey, I hope the stock market crashes in the course of the next 12 months. I mean, why doesn't that stick for those who are listening to it? I know we did this in 2016, maybe in 2020. The argument White House folks who worked for Donald Trump said to me is, you guys take this all so literally, right? He's just... The former president of the United States is rooting for the economy to crash.
Right. And it's helping him instead of hurting him. I've talked to some of the fellow Republicans who ran, and they're like, we've never seen anything like this. If we did this, we wouldn't even get out of the primary.
There are Democrats, though, who believe that this catches up to Trump at some point when the election becomes a choice. That when it is, I mean, both of these candidates are looking beyond the primary. It's actually one of the weird things they have in common. They both are looking past their respective primaries. And there are Democrats who believe that once this becomes a choice, and it is Biden versus Trump, that some of those comments do kind of mount on top of each other. Maybe they're wrong. Maybe that's not the case. But at some point, you know, voters are going to be paying attention, and those comments will resonate at some level.
But they've said that before.
True.
And the comments keep getting worse.
But in 2020, it did.
Nothing catches up.
He lost in 2020.
He did.
Our focus right now, by the way, is on Iowa, but New Hampshire, I think, is where a lot of this stuff gets decided, right? If Nikki Haley can make this thing interesting, or even perhaps defeat him in New Hampshire, then we extend the race. But if she doesn't, if she loses by double digits there, we got a long way to go. Then all things are up in the air again. Let me ask you about Secretary Austin, if I can, for a second here. I was covering this on the Today Show this morning, and even as I was writing the script for the show this morning, I was just trying to make sense of this whole circumstance. It doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, this has been a scandal-free, as it relates to cabinet members, administration. But on this one, why not communicate to the White House? How do they put this behind them? Because it really does get to the issue of competence.
Yeah, unless there is more information that is forthcoming, this really feels like a self-own. I mean, it is a serious diagnosis. We hope that it gets better and is treated well, but it's not unusual. Officials in Washington are diagnosed and treated for cancer while on the job. It has happened all the time. It happened with Ruth Bader Ginsburg 3 times. That in itself is not the scandal, notwithstanding the statement from the spokesman saying that this is deeply personal. He's the head of the Pentagon. He has to keep the public and most definitely the White House
By the way, with
informed.
tensions in the Middle East, at least 14 strikes against bases that house Americans in Iraq and Syria over the course of his hospitalization.
100%. And so that at any time he has to do that. At this point, he definitely has to. Blaming a staffer with the flu is not a great look. This is something that was a self-own, and the White House clearly wants better policies, and you can't blame them.
And there are some who have said, like, he's a private man. I respect that. You're a private person, but this is the life you've chosen. You're the head of the Pentagon. You took the job. You know that it comes with a level of publicity. This stuff is going to come out. That's just kind of the life you chose.
Joe Biden has made it clear he's sticking with him. No interest, no plans to fire him. Austin has no plans to resign right now. Can that hold?
I think it can, depending on how long this lasts. I mean, I think there's it is prostate cancer. We all hope that he recovers fully. Of course. And Joe Biden is I would say he's an empathetic person, certainly when it comes to these issues, medical issues. I don't think he has any desire to lose this record as well as somebody who's had a very stable cabinet. And, the Republicans are trying to push for Austin to get out. I do think in a matter of weeks at some point this is going to die down and he will recover, and this will become another one of the stories that we remember in a few, once the Biden administration is over. I'm not sure it's going to be enough.
And sometimes there's value in taking a step back and remembering the chaos that we saw during the last 4 years as it related to the cabinet, when the president would board a plane and by the time he got off, a different cabinet member was fired, right? So people have to put it in some of the context of what we witnessed. Let me ask you about Senator Menendez, if I can, really quickly right now. Obviously, he is facing a firestorm of controversy and criticism right now. Here he was on the Senate floor today addressing this new superseding indictment against him. Let's play that for you.
The United States Attorney's Office is engaged not in a prosecution, but a persecution. They seek a victory, not justice. I'm innocent, and I intend to prove my innocence. Not just for me, but for the precedent this case will set for you and future members of the Senate. I am, however, alarmed that the greatest and most ardent defenders of the Constitution in this body are among the most vociferous in calling for my resignation.
Sarah, Republicans say there are 2 systems of justice in this country, but the Justice Department is going right after Senator Menendez right now. Does this undercut that argument?
It does a little bit, and frankly, the senator should resign. I mean, it is a Democratic state. It's not going to flip. It's not going to change the Senate. He needs to go. It's just hurting the Democrats. We eventually cleaned up our problem in the House. They should clean up their problem in the Senate.
And it's really interesting for him, who is his constituency right now? Because there's not a person that I've spoken to in the Senate who does not think that he needs to resign.
Even Cory Booker, who is the person who we anticipated would stand with him more strongly than anybody else.
And listen, yes, he is innocent until proven guilty, but the point they're making is focus on that. Focus on your criminal case, but in the meantime, you are a distraction. You can't do the very serious work that needs to be done
closing
here.
thought.
This is going to be a political issue. I mean, he's up for re-election this year. there are polls that show him at literally, I think it was 0%.
Yeah.
You know, people are asking if you support Bob Menendez in New Jersey, like reach out to me, my email, like please email me, I want to know why. It's going to be a political issue. He's probably not going to win the primary. I mean, there's no way he can win the primary. He has two seriously talented, well-funded candidates running against him. It's just, I think it's going to be a political issue, and he's going to, even if he doesn't bow out or is forced out, I think he's going to lose.
Smart panel, good group. Thank you guys for being with us. We appreciate it. And after this break, Middle East leaders delivering a new warning to the United States over the rising civilian death toll in Gaza as the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, meets with the Israeli Prime Minister and his war cabinet. We're going to take you live to Tel Aviv with the very latest. Next, you're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is back in Tel Aviv today for another round of high-stakes meetings with Israeli officials there. During a nearly hour-long meeting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Blinken said that he reiterated prior calls to avoid civilian harm and protect civilian infrastructure inside Gaza, and that he also discussed ongoing efforts to secure the release of the remaining hostages, more than 100 of them still. Blinken also delivered a message to Israeli officials from Arab leaders about the need for a viable two-state solution, even as the war between Israel and Hamas rages on. In a news conference after his meetings, Blinken said he spoke to Israeli officials about a plan to help return displaced Palestinians back home.
We agreed today on a plan for the UN to carry out an assessment mission. It will determine what needs to be done to allow displaced Palestinians to return safely to homes in the north. Palestinian civilians must be able to return home as soon as conditions allow. They must not be pressed to leave Gaza. As I told the Prime Minister, the United States unequivocally rejects any proposals advocating for the resettlement of Palestinians outside of Gaza. And the Prime Minister reaffirmed to me today that this is not the policy of Israel's government.
Joining me now is Ralph Sanchez. He is in Tel Aviv for us again. Ralph, Secretary Blinken seems to be back in Israel with the same message that he had during his last visit in November. What was new today, and how effective is the U.S. effort there right now? President Biden himself was in South Carolina yesterday and says he's doing everything he can right now to try to get the Israelis to sort of reduce the civilian death toll, and yet it continues.
Yeah, Peter, well, the U.S. has a lot of leverage with Israel. The question is, how much is it using it? The administration from President Biden on downwards has made the calculation that they will have more influence by holding Israel close. But there is a lot of criticism from around the world, from Palestinians, that the U.S. needs to do more to rein in Israeli strikes in Gaza. Two main headlines out of Secretary Blinken's marathon meetings today with Israeli officials. One, that sound that you played. The Israeli government has agreed to allow the UN to start looking into how to get some of those million-plus displaced Palestinian civilians returned to their homes in northern Gaza. Secretary Blinken saying that's not going to be an overnight process. That, Peter, frankly, is an understatement. Some analysis shows more than half of all of the buildings in northern Gaza have either been damaged or completely destroyed. It is going to be a very long time before everyone is able to go home. But you heard the secretary say it is vital that Palestinians do go home, and that the United States unequivocally rejects these calls from some far-right members of the Israeli government for Palestinian civilians to be forced out of Gaza into other countries. The other big headline, Secretary Blinken saying that the prospect of peace between Israel and other Arab nations like Saudi Arabia is still on the table, something we've been talking about for a long time before October 7th. But he says Israel will need to make concessions. The war will have to end. Israel will have to agree to resume negotiations towards a Palestinian state, and it will have to agree to allow the Palestinian Authority to return to Gaza after Hamas is defeated. It is not clear, Peter, whether Prime Minister Netanyahu and his right-wing government will be able to make those conditions, those concessions to their right-wing voter base. Peter.
Raf Sanchez on the ground for us again in Tel Aviv with the very latest on Secretary of State Antony Blinken's visit there. Raf, thank you so much. Still to come right here. It has been 5 months since Maui was devastated by the deadliest U.S. wildfire in more than a century. The long road to recovery and Washington's role in helping wildfire survivors across the country. That is next. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Remarkably, yesterday marked 5 months since deadly wildfires devastated the Lahaina community on the Hawaiian island of Maui. The blazes there were some of the deadliest in modern American history. They left 100 people dead and displaced more than 12,000 island residents, many of whom remain without permanent housing today as the fire destroyed thousands of businesses and homes across Lahaina, the island's historic center. Rebuilding efforts are underway, but of course they are expected to be slow-going and costly due to limited labor and resources. Last week, Hawaii's Governor Josh Green unveiled a new interim housing plan for the nearly 6,000 people still sheltering in the island's hotels. We are joined now by Jennifer Gray Thompson, the CEO of After the Fire, an organization focused on improving wildfire recovery. It's nice to see you. Thanks for being here to have a part of this conversation. There's so many things going on in the world. It's hard to believe 5 months have now passed since Lahaina, as our attention spans are so short. So many people, you fear, forget about this, but there are so many challenges that you still face in that community. What are the biggest challenges to rebuilding? How is it going right now? What are the obstacles you're addressing?
Well, you know, I just took a delegation of 13 people who were fire survivors to professionals who'd run major programs at the federal level to Lahaina about a month ago. And we spent a week actually sitting with people all the way from fire survivors to county to Bob Fenton, who's the FEMA administrator. You know, it's a very complicated fire. We actually consider it more of a master class in how to recover from a fire, meaning they're going to need all of our talents, everything we can do. They're really doing some innovative things in Hawaii and in Maui, and so we're optimistic for them, but it's going to be incredibly complicated.
What are some of the unique challenges? What are the biggest challenges right now?
Right now, housing is the biggest challenge, and what they've done...
Where to put these people?
Oh, my gosh, where to put these people, but on an island, too, that already had a housing crisis.
Yeah.
Now, they have about 12,000 empty units of short-term rental housing, which is 3 times more than what they need. And so we're pretty optimistic that they're going to be able to place people in those homes. But it's also in the rebuilding process, because it is an island, it takes 120 days to actually get things there for the materials. And you can't just send things there like some trailers where they will always be there.
120 days to get the necessary resources for rebuilding or trailers or whatever else it may be. I wanted to ask you about the governor in Hawaii, of course, Josh Green, unveiling this interim housing plan, Maui interim housing plan, I think it's formally named. How is that going right now? Does it go far enough to sort of address this and expedite this need?
Well, some people are worried it doesn't go far enough, but I don't really share those worries. I think it's very innovative. We've not seen that kind of public-private, nonprofit effort to really rehouse that many people in such a specific situation. So we actually think that while we will help Lahaina and Maui recover and rebuild, we also believe that they are inventing things there that we are going to be able to use and adapt to other communities in the future.
I want to talk about some of the visits you've had here. Speaking of lawmakers, as you were telling me in the break, you're going to do it for the next couple of days as well. I imagine you're receiving a good reception from the lawmakers here who I hope share your passion, our passion to help rebuild this beautiful part of this country right now. Tax relief is so critical as it relates to legislation. Why is tax relief so important for those there?
There's an error in the tax code that says that if you receive a wildfire settlement, which we anticipate will be true on Maui as well, that you have to claim that as personal income tax. And in doing so, pay that rate. And you cannot deduct your attorney's fees. It's really because the era of mega fires is only about 6 years old. And so this was not an anticipated outcome of our tax code. But at the same time, we really need Republicans, Democrats, independents to work together to make sure that this bill is passed, and passed right now. We don't have time to waste.
Were lawmakers open to that, those you spoke to?
You know, they're very open to it, and we are very optimistic, but it really takes political will, and we are here to make sure we are negotiated in, and we are not negotiated out of the
Well, that's my question, because right now there's still a lot of fighting about all sorts of aid for other parts of the planet. They can't come to some agreement on what to do for Ukraine, for Israel, for the border, right? There's a lot for this Congress to juggle right now. This should be a no-brainer, I would think, for a lot of lawmakers, and nonetheless, it remains a challenge.
You know, we've been working on this for 2.5 years, and no matter where we go, Republican, Democrat, everybody agrees that it's a very important issue. They all agree with it, but what we really need is political will and the desire to get this done for the American people. This goes far beyond, like, there isn't anybody who thinks that our bill is a bad idea, but it's really expending that political will, which is what we need from both sides of the aisle.
We have a tendency in this business to cover the disaster and not be there for the recovery. You guys started this organization after the awful wildfires in Northern California, where I grew up, where you live, back in 2017. They were destructive. There have been more fires since then. What is the state of rebuilding in those 6 years since? And is there sufficient progress there?
You know, it really depends on what the county has. In our case, I come from a wealthier county in Sonoma County, so we are about 95% rebuilt 6 years later. Yeah. But another county, especially rural and frontier, that doesn't have as many resources, like Paradise, amazing community, but they're only about 30% rebuilt 5 years later.
And the biggest takeaway from this conversation, of which there were several, the idea that it can take 4 months to get the necessary resources to Hawaii because it's an island chain, right? You can't just drive that thing from the mainland. It's a real challenge. Jennifer Gray Thompson, it's nice to meet you in person. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
That's going to do it for us this hour. I'm back tomorrow with more Meet the Press. Now the news continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.